Hello, my name is Matthew Emerson. I'm the Managing Director at Blackmore 4, and I'm excited to kick off this new series of video conversations that we're going to be hosting over the next few months. We've historically hosted webinars really intended to give participants insight into topics of leadership, management and organisation, but we wanted to broaden the number of voices in these conversations and broaden the expertise that's coming into this. So going forward, we're going to be welcoming guests to a series that we're calling 4 Questions, simple format, 4 questions. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Marzenna Almendro, who's our new Client Solutions Manager at Blackmore 4. Marzenna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Matthew, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be part of the Blackmore 4 team. And just a little bit about myself. I hail from South Africa, just recently entered the UK and absolutely thrilled to be here. Notoriously, in terms of my history, I am a registered psychometrist or psychometrician. It depends on which language you tend to use. But I've also been in a consulting role for the past decade. I've had quite a varied career, being in a little bit of marketing. I used to run a radio station in South Africa. And in my recent career, I've had the pleasure of engaging with business leaders across Africa, Australasia, as well as Europe. So very excited to be here and absolutely thrilled to be chatting to you today, Matthew.
Great. So I'm going to be a question master today, but going forward, I think Marzenna is going to take a key role in hosting our guests, our future guests in this series. But today you're answering the questions. So to start with, I'll refer back to an article we put out and we shared last year on the topic of the difference between leadership and management. Both incredibly important. We put an opinion out that perhaps divided others and sort of painted a picture of these two things being quite different. Just wanted to get your thoughts on whether they are different, and if so, how do you think leadership and management are different?
Absolutely, Matthew, you're 100% right. There are so many different perspectives when it comes to leadership and management. I mean, a simple Google search will yield 270 million odd articles in terms of the difference between management and leadership. So without getting too complex about it, I reeled into my professional experience in terms of what I've seen from a management and leadership perspective. So to answer your question, plain and simply, is absolutely yes, there is a difference between management and leadership. And let's start to pick that apart. From an academic perspective, when we look at management, we look at individuals that are competent to work within the realm of fuzzy guidelines, that are competent to execute that pragmatic, accurate approach towards business. They're managing teams, they're working within established protocols, established norms, and they really are taking the business vision and turning that into something that is practical and something that they can execute. Okay, so that's my notion of management, and it's deeply seated in Elliott Jacques' stratified systems theory. When we start to look at leadership, however, I feel that leadership is where someone takes on more of a visionary perspective on leading others. So they're no longer translating or working in parallel to strategy, but they're actually hypothesizing or modeling about the future. You know, sometimes notoriously when we look at historical leaders, whether it be the Wright brothers or Sol Kerzner, people typically thought that they're a little bit loony because they had almost this compelling trust in their judgment and discretion when making those decisions about how they wanted to see their vision or the vision executed further. And perhaps this is a bit of a conversation for later on this particular engagement, Matthew, but I think, we're talking about the intricacies of leadership and management, but from a meta perspective, looking at leaders, what I've seen in terms of the most successful leaders are those that inspire people to be leaders within themselves. I mean, managers typically want others to follow them, whereas leaders, in my experience, I've seen just inject that enthusiasm and that inspiration for them to actually not be needed, them to inspire those people to want to be the best that they can possibly be and to actualize within themselves.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. I think There's a fair amount within that I can kind of relate back to some of the perspectives we put out last year in terms of the importance and the nature of so-called management. Of course, it's hard to divide them completely because many people who might label themselves or get labeled as managers or management are often required to lead and vice versa. So I think one of the debates we get into is you can't always distinguish at an individual level between a leader and a manager. A lot of people perhaps need to have a variety of skills across both. Obviously, the last year has been a completely different year to any other, the last year plus, I would say. From your perspective, are there significant key lessons from what's happened over the last year in the way that work has had to be led or managed, I guess, in terms of what you've observed and how we harness those lessons around leadership or management?
Matthew, I think that any business that is still growing today is, they deserve a cheers. It's commendable because it's been absolutely trying, as I'm sure you will agree. But what I've recognized in terms of businesses and leaders that have thrived through this turbulent time of coronavirus and a global pandemic and the changing nature of work is various things. I've seen agility, so that capacity to pivot with the times. I've seen sort of a growing palette for ambiguity and complexity. I mean, notoriously, we look at the various different revolutions, and within Industrial Revolution 1 to 2 to 3, I mean, it was a good 100 years between those. And as we hit the fourth Industrial Revolution, I mean, that was what, 35 years from the third Industrial Revolution. So my point is change is becoming more and more imminent. So successful leaders and role models that have inspired me have been those that have the palette for change, that have the palette for dealing with this complexity and this ambiguity. I mean, Charles Darwin said that survival is dependent on the ability to adapt to our circumstances. I've got a great friend, colleague, business coach, Brent Spilkin, and in his opinion, what he said to me is he personally feels that our change quotient is greater than our IQ or our EQ. And I think there's a lot of value in that in terms of our capacity to be agile to change. Another core trait, characteristic, competency, if you will, is certainly resilience. No good decision comes from a place of fear. So, you know, some managers or some leaders have been scrambling, but those that have sort of risen above and made conscious, authentic decisions, inspired others, really cared about their people, demonstrated resilience. And we've spoken about team resilience. I'm sure we're going to cover it later on in the series, but I think that's absolutely critical as well. So Walt Disney said that you can dream, create, design, and build the most wonderful place in the world, but you need people to make that a reality. So Matthew, the third thing that I've really learned from leaders that I've looked up to is their capacity to stay human. Because as we've said before, we're in business because there's people to serve, there's clients, there's our customers, but there's also a workforce. And at the end of the day, we're all humans. So maintaining that humanness to your approach, that authenticity, that empathy, your emotional intelligence, I think that's been absolutely critical during these times.
Yeah, okay. And I think part of the challenge as we stand here today, sort of April 2021, is those things that we've perhaps become very acutely aware of being important through crisis and through extreme turbulence, as you put it, have always been important. I think they've grown in, we've grown and developed an understanding of those things. They've perhaps always been important, but maybe come to the fore more recently and specifically in times of crisis. But what doesn't appear to be sustainable is that we all go forward at that heightened sort of stress level, that heightened tension that may bring out the good in some, but clearly puts a lot of pressure and kind of, a lot of people really struggle with what we've been through over the last year. So if we project forward and we take a slightly more sort of positive outlook, if you like, into the future, assuming that we're starting to come out of crisis mode, are there things that we learn from either what you've just said or what we've experienced in the last 12 months about real either leadership or management skills, I guess, if you distinguish between the two, that going forward are going to be in most demand. We're not going to be in crisis permanently, but how do we project forward to say, in that backdrop of constant change, what specifically have we learned that's going to enable us to look forward? How do we plan forward, and which specific skills are going to be in most demand in 2022 and beyond?
So I'd like to relate this back to looking at Industry 4.0, and I know it's become somewhat of a buzzword, perhaps a little bit of overkill in terms of, oh my goodness, automation is taking over the world. But I mean, these are qualities that not just managers or leaders, I feel, need to possess, but us as a human race. And those are the soft skills that cannot easily be imitated by AI. Those are things such as your emotional intelligence. What does that even mean? Emotional intelligence, I mean, it depends on which sort of theorem or person you look to in terms of their definition, but it's your sense of self-awareness. It's your sense of engaging with others meaningfully. It's about problem solving without letting emotion contaminate your vision. It's about understanding your environment. From a more cognitive perspective, trust in one's judgment and discretion, I think, is absolutely critical. In terms of resilience and stress management, how are you exercising your resiliency? How are you instigating that resiliency inside your team? Those are probably my top indicators in terms of what I feel will put us at the forefront as leaders going into the future.
Yeah, okay. And as you alluded to, I think we'll probably touch on the topic of resilience more in the future, and really try hard to distinguish between what is a sort of personal level resilience versus a collective team or organizational resilience, both of which, again, quite important but different. So finally then, if I ask you your fourth question, this is 4 questions and hopefully we've got through 3 already. We're often asked for examples, for case studies, for kind of, how does this work in practice? And I'm really keen that we can articulate some of this insight in a way that people can look to and think, is that applicable to me or my organization, or how would I translate that? So the last question is, if there is somebody or an organization that you could think of that has role modeled inspirational leadership through these turbulent times, but in the way that you've projected forward, that really harnesses the things that are vital in this day and age to effectively lead a commercial organization. Have you got an example you could share with us?
So Matthew, to answer your question, I just want to recap on what I said at the beginning of our conversation in terms of management versus leadership. And typical strong managers are those that can execute the strategy, in parallel to what they're doing, work within those fuzzy guidelines, and really, be the person that people want to follow. Inspiring leaders, however, are not just the ones that come up with the vision, and sometimes, we think they're a little bit erratic by trusting their intuition, but the ones that inspire you to be the best that you can be, okay? They don't want to instigate followers. They want to inject that inspiration to lead themselves. So let's bring it back to an individual example for myself. And when I was in my young 20s, and fresh out of university, fresh out of my internship, and obviously all this knowledge, but zero practical experience in terms of engaging with people. But Dr. Shireen Bikram, one of my mentors in my earlier life, she said to me that she trusted me. It was my first feedback session that we had to do, and she trusted me. She wasn't going to sit with me and sort of oversee what I was doing. She trusted me to go forth and give this feedback. So that was really compelling for me, just in terms of a leader that trusts, a leader that empowers. Okay, let's take it a step back and look at people, leaders that I've admired in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. And perhaps it's not a business example, but if I had to look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, when I look at her values when she started at her term, she also inspires me, by the way, because we're so close in age. So I'm like, wow, this woman's amazing. But when we look at her values at the beginning of her term, she was very much around being focused, empathic, and strong. And when I look at her leadership through the past 12 months, she stuck to those core values. I mean, we've had a conversation, Matthew, in the past where businesses have these great values and they use it for marketing purposes, but do they actually live those values? You look at New Zealand today and they've got one of the lowest infection rates. Yes, her direction was draconian to some. I mean, she was taken to task. I think somebody approached the courts in terms of the legislation that she rolled out. But she's just tempered with that humanism as well. She remained focused. She's absolutely passionate about abolishing, well, not abolishing, but at least halving childhood poverty. So just looking at the way in which she's managed herself, managed her country, and engaged with her stakeholders, she's really inspired me. And then, of course, another big time leader who, and this is not over the last 12 months, but perhaps over the last couple of decades, but you may have heard of him. His name's Nelson Mandela, but obviously coming from South Africa and coming from a very politically sort of volatile situation. I mean, Mandela back in those days, he was deemed a terrorist. He did some pretty heinous things, but one thing that stood out for me as a leader is he had an epiphany, and he's actually been quoted saying that I couldn't change others until I changed myself. And that's what he did. And he became a leader of service. I mean, he served almost 3 decades in prison to stand for what he believed in, and he inspired a nation. So yeah, when I look at those sorts of leaders, I think those are probably the ones that really stand out for me.
Excellent, thank you. I was just reflecting on what you were saying. And again, for my relatively simple mind, trying to think through against my observations, a couple of key aspects there. And I think that the last point, self-awareness, but also an acceptance and an appreciation for personal development, personal learning, whichever way you couch it. I think understanding who you are today and how you become who you want to be, if you like, as a leader, I think is constantly important. I think with the other example you gave, for me, there's an aspect of consistency. We often hear this phrase, authentic leadership. I think we wrestle with what that really means and kind of how that looks. But I think the point you made in terms of having personal values or shared values and having those demonstrated, brought to life consistently over time in lots of different ways, regardless of what's happening, kind of being able to demonstrate that they are genuine values that you hold and that your behavior is consistent to them, I think also allows people to believe, trust, you mentioned earlier, and to really accept direction from a leader if they have that trust that this is a consistent pattern of behavior. But thank you for that. Good examples, not all that I'm intimately familiar with, so perhaps I need to do a bit more research and understanding of those as well. So they were our 4 questions. Thank you for answering those, Marzenna. Lovely to have you in the team. Lovely to have you in this inaugural session of 4 questions. And for anybody listening, watching, look out for other topics that we're going to be discussing, as I said at the beginning, with a range of guests that Marzenna and I will be speaking to over the course of the rest of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew.